Welcome, everyone. I'm Helena Hansen, and I am co-chair with Rochelle Dicker of our new UCLA David Geffen School of Medicine research theme in health equity and translational social science. And I want to welcome you to our third seminar meeting that is co-sponsored by the Center for Social Medicine at the School of Medicine. We are very, very privileged to have a panel with three renowned dynamic speakers on the topic of structural racism and biomedical research. I can't think of a more timely topic and a more pressing topic, especially with regard to health equity. And translational social science is an important piece of this because the scholars that you'll hear from today are very active in bridging social scholarship on racism in biomedicine and biomedical research with clinical scholarship. So with no further ado, I want to welcome the panelists, and I'll give you some background on the panelists in a moment, but I want to highlight that we will have another seminar meeting on the program to advance surgical equity here at David Geffen School of Medicine on June 25th at 1 p.m. You'll hear more about that at the very end of this seminar. And so to introduce the speakers, I want to introduce them in order, give you some biographical background in order of their talks. First, we're going to hear from Dr. Terence Keel, who's associate professor with a split appointment here at UCLA, with a split appointment in the Department of African American Studies and the UCLA Institute for Society and Genetics. He's written extensively about race, religion, law, and modern science. His widely acclaimed book, Divine Variations, details how religion helped to produce scientific racism. And he's the founding director of the Biocritical Studies Lab. I love that term, biocritical studies. He currently serves as an associate director for the Ralph Bunche Center for African American Studies. He also serves as associate director for critical theory in the Center for the Study of Racism, Social Justice, and Health. So what a fantastically qualified speaker. Excited to hear from him and also from our second panelist, Nanibaa Garrison, who is an associate professor at the university here at UCLA. She has appointments in the Institute for Society and Genetics, the Institute for Precision Health, and the Division of General Internal Medicine and Health Services Research. She's a teaching faculty member for the UCLA Genetic Counseling Master's Program. She earned her PhD in genetics at Stanford and completed a postdoctoral fellowship in bioethics at the Stanford Center for Biomedical Ethics and the Center for Integration of Research on Genetics and Ethics at Stanford University. Prior to coming to UCLA, she's actually only been here with us for about a year and a half, so we're really pleased to welcome her. Prior to coming, she was an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University and at the University of Washington in Seattle Children's Research Institute. She's the recipient of an NIH K01 Career Development Award to explore perspectives of tribal leaders, physicians, scientists, and policymakers on genetic research with tribes. And her research focuses on the ethical, social, and cultural implications of genetic and genomic research in indigenous communities using community-based research approaches. She engages tribal communities to develop policies and guidance for tribes. And then after we hear from these two incredible speakers, we will have a discussant who is just an amazing person to discuss this topic, Dr. Keith Norris. He's internationally recognized. He's a clinician, scientist, and health policy leader who's made major contributions to diversity, equity, and inclusion while addressing disparities in contemporary society. And he's a professor and the executive vice chair for equity, diversity, inclusion in our own Department of Medicine at UCLA David Geffen School. His research interests focus on hypertension and chronic kidney disease in marginalized populations. And his other research areas include the role of vitamin D in oxidative stress and health disparities, enhancing community academic partnerships, and increasing diversity in the biomedical workforce. He's co-authored over 450 articles in peer-reviewed journals and book chapters, and he serves as the editor-in-chief emeritus of the International Journal of Ethnicity and Disease. So one more thing before we go on to these incredible panelists, I'm going to ask our research theme administrator, Ethel Rojas, to give you a few ground rules and pointers for the Q&A session that's going to follow. Thank you.
Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar. I just wanted to let you know that if you want to ask questions, please feel free to use the chat box, and then during the Q&A session, if you would like to ask the question yourself, you may raise your hand by clicking on reactions, which should be at the bottom of your screen, and there should be a raise hand function right there. And then we'll call on you in the order that you raise your hand. Okay, thank you. And now, let us begin. Dr. Keel.
Sure thing. Thank you to Dr. Henson and to Dr. Keith Morris. I really, North, I really do appreciate this opportunity to share this work, and I really commend you on organizing such a very timely panel. There are a lot of things that are happening in the world right now, and I think we really need to be having these discussions. I'm going to share my screen, so hopefully you all can see, and then get started. So the title of my talk today is Race, Science, and Nihilism. And what I want to share with you, and one of the cases that I want to make this afternoon, is that scientists have to overcome their indifference to racism if they are going to make amends for the racial violence perpetuated by Western biomedicine. And this indifference is a symptom of nihilism, which I'll explain in just a few moments. Recently, the American Journal, or the Journal of American Medical Association, came under fire for hosting a podcast on its website where a white editor and physician doubted the existence of structural racism within medicine. Although the podcast was taken down, it exposed longstanding problems in how the journal has published racist scholarship. Recently, this has included work on COVID-19 risk in African Americans, looking at a single gene variant that controls the activity of their nasal passages, research that denies racial bias in pulse oximeters, an article claiming that students of programs designed to increase diversity in medicine won't make good doctors. Now, given the power and high profile of the journal, work of this sort perpetuate and entrench health inequities that have long harmed and reduced the life expectancy of many people of color. Now, historians of science and medicine have told us for some time now that modern biology in the West was made possible through the racism of white settler colonialism. This includes land appropriation, slavery, warring European nation states over natural resources, grave robbing, the beheading of deceased Native and African people to examine their skulls, and the denial of indigenous sovereignty. These were the material and social conditions that made it possible for early anthropologists and physicians to study human biodiversity and in turn develop medicine and technologies that have largely benefited white populations. This is now an undeniable truth. Yet the violent legacy of white settler colonialism, along with the shadow of nihilism, continue to haunt and animate biomedicine. Some of you might have heard the recent controversy out of Penn and Princeton University in recent weeks. On May 13, 1985, the city of Philadelphia dropped 2 bombs on the compound of the MOVE organization, a revolutionary group of Black people opposed to capitalism and committed to environmental justice and interspecies coexistence. Founded in 1972 by John Africa, MOVE was originally named the Christian Movement for Life. Revolutionary Black religious movements have long inspired the most violent forms of reactionary white supremacy. From Denmark Bessie's slave rebellion in 1791 to the assassination of Martin Luther King. This was true for MOVE, which was seen by civic leaders and the press in Philadelphia as a cult to be feared and treated like the enemy of the state. This fear is what motivated the militarized attack on the MOVE house, which included the use of explosives and military-grade weapons that resulted in the death of 11 people, including 5 children aged 7 to 14, who were either murdered on impact or burned to death. Now, the Philadelphia Medical Examiner's Office turned charred bone fragments pulled from the ashes of the MOVE house and gave them to the Department of Anthropology at the University of Pennsylvania to help identify the remains. This is how they fell into the hands of Professor Alan Mann and Janet Mung in the immediate aftermath of the bombing. To the horror of present-day MOVE members and Black people across the nation, The remains of a child killed in this police attack continued to sit in the possession of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Natural History, and also continued to be used as artifacts in an online course presented in the name of Princeton University and hosted on the online platform Coursera. The class uses as its main case study the events of May 1985, producing as prime evidence a set of bones belonging to a girl in her teens retrieved from the ashes of the move house. Janet Mong teaches the course. Now, recently, video footage of the course shows Janet describing the remains in horrific detail. She explains that they consist of two bones, pelvis and a femur, that belonged to a small girl in her teens that were held together because they were in a pair of jeans, end quote. The pelvis was cracked where a beam of the house had actually fallen on the young child. The fragment showed signs of burnt tendons around the hip joint. Then astonishingly, Janet explains that, quote, the bones are juicy, by which I mean you can tell they are the bones of a recently deceased individual. She continues, if you smell it, it doesn't actually smell bad. It smells kind of greasy, like an older style of grease. Now, the comments here are not just troubling, and they're not just disturbing, but they, in my mind, are a symptom of a form of nihilism that I believe has long haunted biomedical research and has appeared in ways that we have not been courageous enough to acknowledge and to abolish. Now, what I mean by nihilism, I want to say a little bit about this. Now, in our popular definition of nihilism, this tends to mean the belief that human social values have no basis in nature, society, or the cosmos. Nihilism, in a more popular understanding, is often tied to the rejection of the existence of God, most often conceived in the Abrahamic faith traditions, and social commitments derived from such a being. Now, in my understanding of nihilism, I actually draw from the work of the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who argued in the 19th century that nihilism really involves living in a society where after we know that there is no God that can unify us or justify our ethical behavior, we continue to seek out explanations for life and our actions as if there were a God. This contradictory orientation towards a God that no one actually believes in produces a paralyzing hostility towards the ideas and practices that humans create. Now, drawing on Nietzsche's definition of nihilism, I take things a step further and coin the term biomedical nihilism. And what I mean by this is the belief that nature is more consequential to life than the effects of human designs such as discriminatory laws, economic inequality, segregation, violence, etc. This denial keeps alive the conviction that living beings can be understood in a state of nature freed from society. Ironically, this belief leads to divinizing nature, where biogenetic mechanisms are understood as if they were produced by God, and thus making them more meaningful than social creations that have measurable effects on life. Biomedical nihilism is often characterized by an unbridled curiosity detached from ethical principles that would allow researchers to see how their own questions are already socially and politically conditioned. This, I believe, describes the kind of indifference to the racialized violence that this young 14-year-old child suffered at the hands of the Philadelphia police just a few decades ago. And that an entire course designed to teach about the remains of a person who was the subject of white supremacy and the violence of a police state did not make its way into the scientific analysis or the ethical framing, or the outrage rather, of the scientists who were teaching the course like this in Coursera. Now, I actually believe that the race concept itself is very vulnerable to this form of biomedical nihilism. In fact, I've written about how the race concept in science and medicine has been shaped by an understanding of heredity and ancestry that has largely been hostile or ignored social environmental factors that create human biodiversity. And this hostility results in a kind of gene-centric view of race that suffers from a kind of a limited imagination, which presupposes or assumes that nature is more consequential to life than the effects of human designs. So, for example, longtime New York Times science writer Nicholas Wade published a very controversial book in 2014, A Troublesome Inheritance, where he claims to have surveyed the last several decades of scientific literature within the field of population genetics, evolutionary science and biological science more broadly, to argue that it is definitive that scientists have shown that in fact race is a viable biological category, but the political correctness of the left has prevented us from actually acknowledging this at a social level, and that scientists need to actually muster up the strength and the courage to ignore the kind of politics of political correctness and actually embrace that race indeed is a living biological entity. And he goes on to say the following, which I think really resonate with this larger tradition of thinking about race in ways that ignores or suppresses the notion that human activity actually formed biodiversity. And he says the following: human evolution has not only been recent and extensive, it's also been regional. The period of 30,000 to 5,000 years ago from which signals of recent natural selection can be detected occurred after the splitting of the three major races, and so represents selection that has largely occurred independently within each race. The notion here being that we're talking about biologically separate and isolated populations that have not mixed and therefore have undergone forms of evolution that make them biologically meaningfully different. Three principal races are Africans, East Asians, and Caucasians. And that in each of these races, a different set of genes has been changed by natural selection. Part of the work that I've done is to show actually that this understanding of human racial ancestry can be really traced back to the religious and cultural history of the European Western scientific imagination, where early scholars who were influenced by Christian theology assumed and used the story of Noah's three sons to argue that the original human races were all descended from Noah's original families, and that Shem, Ham, and Japheth would go on to repopulate the earth and give rise to the various races that would be found in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And what you're looking at here is a TO map dated back from the 10th century. At the very top, you see the world divided into three continental land masses, and these are the three waterways which are thought to be the most significant. Asia appears at the top, Africa at the bottom right, and Europe on the left. But underneath each of these regions are the names of Noah's three sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. And that what I've shown in previous work is how this sort of conceptual framing has really shaped the research questions and the data collecting efforts of scientists working since at least the 10th century. And that there are real consequences for continuing to inhabit an imagination that believes that some being, be it God or nature, has designed racial groups to have the various forms and traits that continue to be passed on from one generation to the next. And the irony here, though, is that population geneticists have known for quite some time that race is not a viable biological category. And in fact, the work of Sewell Wright in 1943 developed the notion of a population fixation index, which is a way to measure the amount of genetic difference that any two populations you happen to be wanting to compare actually have. And what this fixation index allowed Wright to declare as early as 1940s is that when you look at human groups themselves, they do not present genetic difference that reaches a threshold that he thought was statistically meaningful for population difference. This was a threshold of 0.25 in terms of FST values. And when we actually look at populations and we do comparisons of FST values across European, sub-Saharan, and Asian populations and comparing them with each other, what we find are that some of the most geographically isolated populations, so for example, populations in Africa, when compared to populations in China, they have an FST value of 0.192. Populations, if we compare African populations to Japanese, 0.190. And then if we compare the FST values of Europeans with sub-Saharan Africans, we see that they have an FST value of 0.153. What this tells us is that at the level of population structure, there is not meaningful amount of difference to speak about human groups as separate genetic or biological races. And in fact, actually more recent studies have actually followed up to show that if you look at regions of our genome that actually code for protein and other physiological behaviors, we find that when comparing actually regions that have functional value, the FST values of these regions was 0.055. So again, we're talking about FST values that do not substantiate the belief that races are biologically meaningful. And yet, despite this, population geneticists and scientists continue to speak in ways that give life to the belief that there are meaningful genetic and biological differences across human groups. So David Wright, the well-known and quite popular population geneticist who has pioneered some of the sort of early work on looking and synthesizing the remains of ancient human DNA, has said actually that recent genetic studies have demonstrated differences across populations, not just in genetic determinations of simple traits and skin color, which I should note here that skin color is not a simple genetic trait. There's quite a bit of work to show that, but also in more complex traits like bodily dimensions and susceptibility to disease. For example, we now know that genetic factors help explain why Northern Europeans are taller on average than Southern Europeans, why multiple sclerosis is more common in European Americans than in African Americans, and why the reverse is true for end-stage kidney disease. So we see here that this gene-centric understanding of racial difference continues to be quite powerful. And not just that, but so powerful that it downplays and suppresses our awareness of social political factors that contribute to end-of-stage, end-of-life kidney failure, or contribute to various forms of physiological behavior and disorder that can be tied to social structure, human practices, and not merely nature, not merely genetics. We're talking about the combination of society and biology together that often gets downpressed, ignored, or outright rejected in a lot of the ways that geneticists think and imagine human difference. And I believe that part of this has to do with sort of the haunting influence of what was known in the kind of Christian context of the creator God, which is an idea that a divine being has designed nature and all living entities within it with traits and characteristics for a purpose. And that this notion has huge implications for how early natural historians up to contemporary geneticists have imagined racial differences. So for example, the Christian theologian Saint Augustine of Hippo wrote the following about this divine being that designed living things with what he called seeds, and seeds would be translated roughly into our contemporary language as sort of genetics. He says, "For as mothers are pregnant with unborn offspring, so the world itself is pregnant with the causes of unborn beings, which are not created in it except from the highest essence, where nothing is either born or dies." The idea here being that God gives living things the seeds to manifest all the various traits and characteristics that are going to ever manifest themselves in living entities. And at this time, there was an assumption that women carried within their womb, and Eve in particular carried within her womb, all the unborn racial beings that would ever exist in human history. He goes on to say, all the organs are latent in the seed, even though at birth some have not yet appeared. On this basis, the infant is already short or tall if he is going to be short or tall. Environment, context, these things don't influence these sort of natural seeds that come from a divine being. When we go forward to the 17th century, we see a very similar idea in the thought of John Ray, who was considered sort of one of the founding fathers of British natural history. And a lot of his work was quite influential among the generation of scholars who were trained, Charles Darwin and many other sort of early evolutionary thinkers. And he too would take on this notion of the seed to make this argument that animals and plants propagate from unique seeds that are not shared across each other. And that the idea being here is that the physical traits of various living things follow a kind of biological mechanism that is thought to be largely meaningful and has huge consequences throughout multiple generations. Now, this notion actually would get picked up in the 19th century among ethnologists and anthropologists who rejected the notion of shared human ancestry and made the case that each racial group is derived from a unique ancestor. And we see here a kind of racial classification system that was created by Josiah Knott and G.R. Glidden in 1854 on the eve of the Civil War. And the argument here is that humans don't share common ancestry. And we know this is that we look at the physical traits of humans in their indigenous organic environment. We find that each of the apparent races at the time seem to have similar morphological traits as other animals or living entities within their natural habitat. So we have here at the time the representation of the various races of humanity. And at the bottom below, we see their various goals and physiological traits of these groups. The idea being is that nature, God, give purpose and meaning to the physical traits, and that the activities of human beings, the effort to create a a democratic republic that would actually emancipate African slaves, which was on the minds of the scientists at the time, these things would not change these inborn natural entities that would manifest themselves over time. And in fact, J.R. Josiah Nott made this argument to say that emancipation would undo a kind of natural order that has meaningfully divided human racial groups into various traits and characteristics. In other words, the African could never be an equal political partner to European Americans. Later, if we look at the work of William Bateson, who is very influential for translating the theories of Gregor Mendel and his principles of heredity and giving early population geneticists a kind of vocabulary for thinking about evolutionary biology and the inheritance of acquired traits over time, he too makes a similar argument with the notion of character units, which we could translate either in the past as seeds or in our more present biological vocabulary, genetics, and makes the argument that these character units are the fundamental elements of living things, and that the environment might create interferences, but these interferences are largely subordinate to this sort of character units that are passed on through time. And one has to ask the question, both what are the consequences of this type of thinking, this notion that racial groups and human beings have physiological traits that regardless of what environmental context one finds them, these things will manifest themselves. And I asked this question while thinking about the recent murder of George Floyd. Now, we all witnessed the court case and the conviction of Derek Chauvin. But if we can go back a year ago when the Hennepin County Medical Examiner first released the autopsy of George Floyd, what the autopsy argued was that there were underlying biological genetic conditions that contributed to the death of George Floyd. And that, in fact, actually, if you look at the language and framing of the Hennepin County Medical Examiner corner, you can see very clearly that there is an assumption that his biology, his innate characteristics are what caused his death, not the actual police. So if you look at the first cause of death that appears on the Hennepin County Medical Examiner corner report, cardiopulmonary arrests, complicating law enforcement subdue. The idea being that his heart attack added complications to the effort of law enforcement to restrain him. Secondly, restraint. Third, neck compression. How did the injury occur? Well, the decedent experienced a heart attack while being restrained by law enforcement. Notice the agency there. The agency for the cause of death is within his own body. It's not the police. Secondly, other significant conditions that were noted by the medical examiner corner. One, hypertensive heart disease. These were contributing factors to his death, fentanyl intoxication, and then recent methamphetamine use. Now, what I want to have you think about is how we could rewrite the cause of death for George Floyd in ways that actually highlights the social human designs that contributed to his death. How can we think about his death in ways that frees itself from this sort of gene-centric or very limited understanding of biology that doesn't take into consideration society and its measurable effects on living entities? And the way that we could do this is by writing a cause of death in this way. Law enforcement induced cardiopulmonary arrest while restraining the deceased. And notice that the imputation of agency here is important, because what the conviction says is exactly this: Derek Chauvin killed him. But the actual medical record of the medical examiner, I believe, suffers from a kind of form of nihilism that is apolitical and value neutral, and is unwilling to actually impute agency of the state, of the police, of various forms of structural racism that we know and have seen with our own eyes to end the lives of Black people. And in fact, actually, the forensic pathologists that were hired by the family of George Floyd and the independent autopsy that was used, they came to a different set of conclusions that I think were close to where we should be in terms of using biomedical research to actually undo racism, but not quite far enough. And you'll see what I mean in a minute. For them, the cause of death was asphyxia due to compression of the neck. It's the first cause of death. Asphyxia due to compression of the back, restricting blood flow. How did the injury occur? Compressive pressure to the neck and back by the police, and its effects, and this is the most important part, can only be seen in the direct encounter with the police itself. Why I think this is so meaningful that the secondary autopsy said this is that you cannot observe the death of Black people in this context separated from society. One has to literally see biology and society together. In this case, society being law enforcement and the racism of Derek Chauvin as the entity, the thing that's creating the actual loss of life. Other significant conditions, they found that there was no underlying medical problems that contributed to his death. Now, how I would rewrite this actually is to say that asphyxia was due to compression of the neck by law enforcement. Again, imputing agency to the entity that is causing the loss of life, and not just agency in an abstract way, but identifying the social human practices that actually limit life itself. Now, to bring this a bit to a close, the danger here, and we all witness this, is that the attorney for Derek Chauvin actually made the argument that George Floyd died because of an overdose and a heart condition, that in fact, his biology was the reason why he died, not the actions of Derek Chauvin. Now, fortunately, the jury saw through this highly flawed argument, but it still reveals to us the amount of work that needs to be done. To summarize, or to kind of bring this to a close, if physicians and scientists working in the life sciences want to redress the legacy of structural racism, it involves taking Black life seriously. It involves taking seriously the lethal agency of social designs. This includes policies, economic inequality, and actual state violence itself. And until scientists are willing to actually acknowledge this, study it in their research, identify it within the bodies of people who have suffered under structural racism, we will continue to be haunted by forms of nihilism that don't allow us to see how the societies we design are actually embodied in the lives and the health outcomes of human people. Thank you for your time.
That was great, Terence. Thank you so much. And next, we're going to have Dr. Nanibaa Garrison. She's going to give us some reflections through the lens of some of the work she does, and then we'll have time for some discussion at the end.
Great, thank you, Dr. Norris. And this is really going to be interesting following on the heels of Dr. Keel. Thank you so much for that presentation. It really gives me a lot to think about, especially in light of what I plan to present today, which is quite different, but I think you'll see some parallels in the work that I've been doing with Indigenous communities. I first want to start by acknowledging that UCLA is located on the homelands of the Tongva people as the traditional caretakers of the Tobangar. And I'm really honored to be here today to present this work. I myself am from the Navajo Nation. I grew up on the Navajo Reservation in Arizona, so I'm not terribly far from my own Indigenous homelands as well. I'll talk a little bit today about some of the ethical issues that have arisen in Indigenous communities, particularly as it pertains to genetics. And I first want to start by talking about some experiences that different Indigenous tribes have faced. And I'll use this as a way to sort of draw parallels to what is going on today and some ways that we can move forward with addressing these different issues that tribes have experienced. Some of you may have heard of the Havasupai tribes participation in a genetic research study that took place in the 1990s. And the Havasupai tribe are located near the in the Grand Canyon in Arizona. They have high rates of diabetes and sought out the help of a genetics researcher to help understand the reasons for their high rates of diabetes. The researcher received institutional review board approval and conducted an informed consent process that was seeking to look for issues on behavioral/medical problems. And blood samples were collected from over 400 tribal members who were very interested in understanding why their tribe had such high rates of diabetes. It turned out that the results for the diabetes study was inconclusive, and in 2010, in 2003, the tribe sued researchers because they realized that their samples were shared with other researchers and used on studies on schizophrenia, inbreeding, and migration. And this case went back and forth in court for a number of years and settled in 2010, in which the tribe received some monetary compensation, and they also had an out-of-court settlement that allowed them to have their DNA samples returned. This case raised a lot of attention in the media, and a lot of tribes across the United States and also internationally paid pretty close attention to what was going on with the litigation. And the case raised a lot of ethical issues around informed consent. What technically is informed consent? What are appropriate ways of engaging with communities and participating in research? How do we work with populations who might be coming from lower socioeconomic status or quote unquote vulnerable populations? There were a lot of technicalities with the timing of the lawsuit, the informed consent form, because of the language that was used, behavioral/medical problems. Some people argued that that was sufficiently broad enough to capture a wide range of different studies, including the subsequent studies on schizophrenia and inbreeding and population genetics. So a lot of tribes were very cautious about participating in research. This case settled in 2010, and we really haven't seen a whole lot of tribes being very interested in participating in research, although that is starting to change now. Also around that same time, the Nuu-chah-nulth, which is a tribe in British Columbia, just north of Seattle, Washington, also participated in a research project where they donated 800 samples from their tribe to a rheumatoid arthritis study in the 1980s. The study started at the University of British Columbia, but the investigator subsequently moved, as many academics do, and he took those samples with him to the University of Utah and the University of Oxford. And the rheumatoid arthritis studies did not pan out, and this researcher ultimately used those DNA samples on ancestry studies looking at retroviruses and also drug abuse, and published over 200 papers on his career. Throughout his career, many of them were using samples from this tribe, but never came back to the tribe and reported any of the results, never talked about, what was found or not found pertaining to rheumatoid arthritis or anything else. And when the investigator passed away unexpectedly around 2000, in the early 2000s, there was an effort by other investigators at the University of British Columbia to try to find these DNA samples, to track them all down and return them back to the tribe. And that in a newsletter, the tribe was celebrating returning those samples back to the West Coast, back to their tribe. It took a large effort on behalf of many researchers who knew this particular researcher to go through different lab reports and lab notebooks and different communication chains to try to figure out where all of these samples had spread to around the world and to bring that back. One of the elders who had participated in this study said that our family has been hit pretty hard by arthritis. It's really hard to watch someone you love suffer like that when you can't do anything to help. And this individual really thought that he was being able to help by donating these samples, and then to find out that none of this work was actually taking place was really problematic and really hurt a lot of people. Around that time, Laura Arbour and Doris Cook in Canada came up with a concept, or wrote a paper entitled DNA on Loan, Issues to Consider When Carrying Out Genetic Research with Aboriginal Families and Communities. And they put forth this idea of DNA on loan as being as kind of pushing against the idea of ownership, that when a person agrees to participate in a genetic research study, that they are not giving over their DNA sample, they're not donating and giving a sample over, that they will have no say in how things are done, or they're not. The idea is that they're not just kind of giving something to a person and then not ever having any say so in how that sample is done or how that sample is used. But the idea that a person is loaning their DNA to you for you to use that in research purposes that are relevant to them, but ultimately the ownership still still belongs to the person who donated that sample, and you still have obligations to that person. You still have ethical obligations and moral obligations to report back to that person and tell them what happened with their DNA sample. That there's not really a transfer of ownership, but that the idea is that DNA should really be thought of as allowing other researchers to have stewardship over that so that they can use those samples. And that was a pretty big concept that made a lot of people sort of pause and wonder, what, is this even realistic? Can we even really think about DNA being on loan to researchers? What would that look like? I also just want to say that the representation of Indigenous peoples in genetic research studies really has not grown very much over the past couple of decades. And I think some of the reasons why are because of the studies that I just described and the frustrations that Indigenous peoples have had when participating in genetics research. In a couple of recent estimates from 2009, 2016, and 2019, several different studies have looked at a number of genetic research studies that have been published and tried to estimate how many people are representing, trying to estimate the representation of people in these different databases or in these different research studies, looking at people from all around the world. And what we have seen is, for example, in 2009, several estimates show that only 4% of people who participated in genome-wide association studies are people of non-European ancestry. And although we've seen quite a bit of growth from 2009 to 2016, where 19% of people are of non-European ancestry, most of that growth has actually been in Asian countries. And so when we look at the proportion of people who are identified as or are classified as Indigenous peoples, those numbers have actually decreased. And I'm not showing that in a graph form on this slide because it would be difficult to display all of that information quickly. But we have seen that the estimates have decreased from 0.06% to 0.02% in 2019. And we don't really know the true number here, but these are just estimates of how much the estimates of how Indigenous peoples are represented in these studies. I, as a geneticist, trained as a geneticist turned bioethicist, am really concerned about these numbers because I would like to see Indigenous peoples participating in genetics research. I would like to see representation in genetics research so that Indigenous peoples and people of all different backgrounds can stand to benefit from all of the great work that is coming out of genetics research. But if we don't have participation from people of these underrepresented backgrounds, we might not find the appropriate interventions that could be beneficial to these populations, and we'll kind of having fewer and fewer people benefiting from research, and research not really changing as a result. I have been involved in the summer internship for Indigenous peoples in genomics, or SING, since 2010. And one of the things that we did here was to really try to find a way to engage Indigenous peoples in genetics research, particularly because people were nervous about participating in genetics research. When I started my PhD program back in 2003, this was right when the Havasupai tribe had filed its lawsuit. A lot of people told me that I should not pursue a degree in genetics. I would never find a job in genetics. I would never find anything to do with genetics. And so many Indigenous peoples are so against genetics that it would be sort of selling my soul. And a lot of people tried to dissuade me from pursuing that. I did anyway, and I became much more interested in the ethical issues as I was pursuing my PhD, and really began to start to unweave sort of the long-standing distrust that people have been feeling, and try to find ways to change the narrative and change the way that we think about genetics research and change the way that we engage people in genetics research. So this program is one attempt at doing that, and we offer a week-long curriculum to people who will come for to 20 participants who come for a week and spend time getting lab experience both in the wet lab and bioinformatics labs. And we have interactive sessions that involve a lot of discussions around ethics, around policy, around tribal law, consent. And we really try to engage people in meaningful discussions about genetics and try to help people find a way to voice concerns about genetics when they see issues around genetics research happening. To date, in the US, we've trained over 100 Indigenous participants from over 44 different tribes and communities. And participants are pretty diverse in itself. People come from tribal colleges. Some participants are undergraduate or graduate students, and others are much more advanced in their academic careers. Some are even industry scientists. And some actually do come from the community itself, where they are not, where they might be working as tribal leaders or engaging quite a bit with tribal leaders. And SYNC has actually spread to other countries over the past couple of years, to New Zealand, Canada, and Australia. And the goals are pretty similar, where we are really trying to find ways to engage Indigenous peoples in thinking about ethical issues that come up in research. We're trying to find ways to change the way that we talk about genetics research and engage with each other. And that has culminated in quite a wide range of people who are coming out of this program. This picture includes a couple of people who work with tribal governments and with tribal leaders. So that's been really fun to see. But one of the things that has come out of this as well is the development of the SYNC Consortium, the Summer Internship for Indigenous Peoples in Genomics. One year, I think in 2016 or 15, we had a alumni conference where we brought people together to try to figure out what are the next steps for SYNC. And we formed a consortium of people who are faculty and alumni to start thinking about what do we do now that we've trained this nice mass of people who are savvy and adept and can talk about ethical issues in genetics. We've done a really great job at training ourselves and hosting these workshops, but what can we do that is more outward facing? And so this consortium of people have started to come together to start thinking about ways to develop frameworks for better engagement, better science, and better capacity building within our group, but also outside. And also over the years, there have been a number of growing concerns around the research around ancient DNA and or paleogenomics. And we began to start thinking about how do we engage scientists in a way that they can listen to our concerns without, completely putting them down where they might not listen, but also to really think about the science critically and address the scientific concerns that we have in a way that will help to make both the science and ethics better for everyone. So we came out with a couple of different papers over the past couple of years. One is a framework for ethical research, looking at some of the driving questions here were how should researchers foster stronger collaborations with communities? And one of the motivations behind this that many of us share is that the inclusion of all populations has the potential to expand our understanding of genetic influences on health. And I've been particularly interested in some of the issues that bias might raise, that when research is conducted only by people of white European ancestry, for example, they might not necessarily include perspectives that come from Indigenous peoples or from people from other populations. And the interpretations and the results of those studies might have some inherent biases in them, even though science is really trying to be objective and we are trained as scientists that we need to step back and have some objectivity. There's always a strand of bias that runs through the way that we think about how to interpret research results and how we report them back out. So in developing this framework, we came up with multiple different components of what research looks like, really drawing upon community-based participatory research. And we identified that for communities, particularly Indigenous communities, understanding tribal sovereignty and research regulation is at the core of all of these different issues that we were concerned about. And we also thought that community engagement really encapsulates that core and is really all-encompassing and really needs to be a thread that ties all of the different research components together. We've also identified additional issues such as ways to build cultural competency. So as Indigenous scientists, we were really concerned that many researchers who came into Indigenous communities really did not understand the cultural context. They may not necessarily understand the cultural nuances or norms that people have, and they needed to be able to understand that in order to really influence and engage people in research. We also really have been pushing to improve transparency of research practices. So thinking back to the Havasupai case that I described earlier, there was a lack of transparency in that informed consent process, and the tribe members did not know that the researchers had been intending to do subsequent research on those studies. I didn't get into those details, but as the lawsuit unfolded, it really became clear that there was really a lack of transparency over how those samples were being used and who was having access to those samples. We've also been really pushing for building tribal research capacity. So the SING program is one way that we've been doing that, but we've also been really encouraging people to engage with their community in different ways. This could be having workshops so that researchers who are working with different communities can share with the community what is going on, and that could be a place where students from the community can get engaged in the research process and start to learn the research skills and start to conduct the research over time as they become more savvy with how research is conducted. And then we really push researchers to really think about ways to disseminate findings in a community accessible format. Sometimes a community accessible format is not a peer-reviewed journal article, but it's more like it could be a webinar, it could be a radio forum, it could be a YouTube video. There are many different ways that community members might want to receive information about a research study. And so I think I really would push people to think about creative ways to do so. The SING consortium has also been increasingly concerned about ancient DNA research. And one example is the Ancient One, the Ancient One is an ancestor that tribes in Washington asserted was a part of their ancestral background. And many people might know this the Ancient One as a Kennewick man, but we've really been trying to respect the name that the Indigenous peoples have chosen to talk about the Ancient One. The Ancient One, the Ancient One's remains were identified were uncovered along a river in Washington, and for many, many years there were fights back and forth to repatriate the Ancient One and return him back to his homelands and bury him. And several different tribes were using NAGPRA, the Native Americans Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, to try to get their ancestor back home. And for many years, there were debates going back and forth where researchers did not want to release the Ancient One back. And only after doing some genome analyses were there enough evidence to show that people who live in that region may be descendants of this individual or may have some shared ancestry with this individual. And so that allowed the tribes to go back and claim their ancestor. I think a lot of these types of studies around ancient DNA has really raised a lot of different concerns. So the SING consortium also began to write about this. We were involved in a commentary called Chaco Canyon Digs Chaco Canyon Dig Unearths Ethical Concerns. Chaco Canyon is a location located near the Navajo Nation, and there were concerns after some papers were published looking at different artifacts and remains that were identified there that indicated that that there was actually a strong maternal line that was identified, showing that Indigenous peoples who lived in Chaco Canyon a long time ago may actually have had ways of engaging with each other where there is a strong maternal line that may have indicated that that the community was a matrilineal community. And this finding doesn't really, this finding that the researchers published, it did not really seem to make a lot of sense to the participants, to the community members, because there were a lot of tribes in that community who felt like their ancestral stories were not even considered in the interpretations of these results. The interpretations kind of used words that were not very respectful, and people were not, a lot of community members were upset about how some terms like skeletal remains and just sort of the dehumanizing of these different pieces of their ancestors was described, really prompted the SING consortium to raise sort of these concerns that people had. And it also led us to publish another paper in Science that basically put forward a checklist of who should be consulted in participating in research, particularly around ancient DNA. With ancient DNA research, there's really very little regulation because ancestors are not subject to human subjects research. There's a void here in thinking about what are the appropriate things to do when engaging communities. Should we engage communities, and how should communities be engaged if we do engage them, and what should happen to different parts of what should happen after a project ends in terms of the items that were used in the analysis of DNA. And so we've really been interested in highlighting this as an issue and putting together some ways of engaging researchers to think about questions that they should be asking of communities rather than going to a site and excavating ancestors and their belongings. We really should be encouraging them to engage in the local communities and trying to understand how they feel or think about those ancestors and collaborate with them rather than kind of just going into the community without letting them know that they are there. So coming back to the Havasupai case, one of the concerns that I've had around engaging Indigenous peoples in these conversations about genetics is just sort of the different ways that people are thinking about this. After the Havasupai case settled, Teresa Markow, who was the PI who conducted those studies on diabetes, schizophrenia, and inbreeding, even after the case was ending, she maintained that she had done nothing wrong. And when she was interviewed during the lawsuit, she had stated, knowledge is power, and the more one knows, the better off one is from a research perspective. And that, I think, really hit home for a lot of people, where they were just really, a lot of Indigenous peoples really felt like, although knowledge can be power, there really is more power in thinking about ways to collaborate and to do things right and to think about the ethical dimensions of all of our work. Carlito Tilawisi, who is one of the lead plaintiffs of the Havasupai case, Havasupai tribe's lawsuit, said even after the lawsuit settled, "I'm not against scientific research. I just want it to be done right. They use our blood for all of these studies. People got degrees and grants, and they never asked our permission." So just to draw this to a close, I think that bringing community members into the research process and allowing them to offer interpretations of the research results will really allow us to have much better ways of including these community perspectives and thinking about ways to understand the research results that we are finding when doing any kind of research, qualitative research, quantitative research. If we are able to engage community members in understanding what their thought process is about the results, we might have the chance to have a much better, more nuanced way of interpreting those results. And I think it's also important to listen to a range of perspectives, including oral histories. Thinking about what's important to different communities would be really important in thinking about those interpretations of research results, interpretations of the way that we move forward. And I also think it's important to create space for all peoples, all parties to feel comfortable in raising concerns, issues, or suggestions to improve. I think this is sometimes hard for scientists to hear because scientists are taught to be rigorous and unbiased and really move forward. But then sometimes in doing so, we might forget to think about ways of incorporating different perspectives that come from people who might not have the same level of education attainment as we as researchers might have. So I want to stop there and just thank a number of people who have helped me think through some of these issues and concerns over the years. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Garrison. And again, thank you, Dr. Keel. It's been great to hear these two sort of distinct yet complementary presentations, really touching on a variety of aspects of health and a focus on different views of ancestry and race, biology, ethics. And so I think it touches upon a lot of elements that I'm sure the audience is very interested in. That's why we have a lot of people joining us today. And I think we will go and take some questions from the audience now and get a sense of what are some things that have either been on people's minds before or things that might have arisen based on these presentations where they would like either one of you to maybe provide a little more depth and or maybe we'll have something else that'll pop up that'll be of interest. So let's go and see if we have any questions that have come from the audience yet. Okay. And while we're waiting, so one thing that comes up, a question that comes up a lot is this issue of race as a social construct versus its race as being biologic, which Terence really addressed in his presentation. But I think what we tend to hear a lot is, well, and what I see a lot is, I see paper after paper and presentation after presentation where people saying, you know, they start out by saying, yes, we first want to define that race as a social construct. And then they go straight ahead to treating it as if it's a biologic construct in the work they do. So how do we, so we have these colleagues and this is what they do all the time. Any ideas or thoughts on how we sort of might approach our colleagues about this and engage them in that?
Well, I think that's a great question. You know, I think the debate around race as a social construct has gone from a moment in the 1990s where there are a lot of people who were opposed to race and trying to sort of reveal it to be an illusion, to where we are now actually from the work of Chandra Ford and Nancy Krieger and many others, to see that if you live in a racist society, we should expect that society to have biological effects that can be measured on the bodies of people who are subjected to that racism.
Right.
So if you do a research design, you're trying to figure out breast cancer risk in a population at a very particular location, you might need race to start that study, but only because you're trying to actually measure the effects of the society on a person who happens to be racialized as a Black body and as a woman, for example, which is very different than saying that some ancient allele or risk factor from a population or a person 3,000, 5,000 years ago, isolated in time, is the driving factor for why this person is having a particular health outcome. That's old style racism in the sense of believing that what you are is largely determined by your ancestry. And we know better now. We know that we can actually measure things like, how close are you to a Superfund site? Do you get enough exercise? What's the daily interaction with your clinician or family members like? Do you have forms of stress that might create cortisol levels that rise and cause all kinds of other health outcomes? These are things that are a reflection of our society. And so I think as a way to summarize this, I would say that we have to resist grand scale generalizations about Black people or people of color, but actually instead have very local regional studies and resist the temptation to overgeneralize, because I think location matters greatly. And that often gets lost when we try to sort of make these grand sweeping claims that biologize race.
Great. We have one question in the chat box. First, thanks to everyone for great talks. So we always want to do that shout out. Dr. Keel, can you share your thoughts on ethnopharmacology research?
I think the question is, if I understand the question, is about the idea of this larger trend of precision medicine and medicine that's tailored specifically to your individual genome, but then also the ancestry that you might share with other people given the continent from which you might be derived. I think that too it's a double-edged sword. We have to first ask ourselves, and we should have a healthy suspicion of pharmaceuticals, which don't often actually address the underlying condition, which if it's structural and social, won't really resolve the problem. So if you're trying to understand whether African Americans are going to respond better to a drug for hypertension, what are you really interested in doing? Are you interested in solving hypertension? Because if you are, then it's not just about a drug, it's about a larger social system of economic inequality, access to healthcare, nutrition, whether these people live in neighborhoods that are food deserts, they have sidewalks in their neighborhoods. These are larger contributing factors to things like hypertension. And the idea that a pharmaceutical drug will simply solve those structural things just completely misses the mark. And so I would say that an effort to sequence the genomes of people and say that somehow genetically they may have different reactions to a drug misses the larger structural systems that sustain health inequalities, even inequalities that might persist if you give them the drug that actually might treat them. And I think that's the real danger, because now we're talking about, the amount of money the healthcare system pays out to pharmaceuticals and making a lot of money for companies that don't actually help people get better.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, because it's really great because, we can have these polymorphisms and people can try to look at its association and the effect of a drug for an individual that has a specific gene polymorphism, but then that gene polymorphism lives within an individual that lives within a society, right? And so that we'll also have to think about that.
But to add to that,
Yes.
in the conversations that I've had with many different communities, talking about pharmacogenetics research seems to be like the low-hanging fruit and the way to get people interested in participating in genetics research, because pharmacogenetics research seems to be have more of a tangible outcome than something like the All of Us research program, or participating in a research study on diabetes where, there have been many, many studies on diabetes and nothing's really come out of that in terms of something tangible for communities to get some sort of benefit from. So, I think it's interesting that we need to think about all of these different dimensions that Dr. Keel mentioned, but at the same time, we have to be careful about how we communicate with communities who want some sort of tangible outcome. And pharmacogenomics just seems to be that one where people are promising that there's a better chance of that happening.
So this is great. With the two responses each of you just provided, because the next question asks, is it possible to integrate sort of the two areas around community and ethics and race and genetics per se. And the question is, are we able to engage in ethical, representative research and answer the questions of various populations, such as higher rates of diabetes, rheumatoid arthritis, while paying heed to the social and environmental realities of racism? So either
I'll let Dr. Garrison take the lead on that.
Thank you. That's a tough one. But I think one of the things that I think can be done, I talked a lot about engaging communities and in research and in thinking about capacity building and, different ways that we're doing that. But I think one of the things that we haven't really thought enough about really is to think about addressing these issues of inequity and medical racism. We talk about it in terms of, we're very underrepresented, but we haven't really talked about the ways to dismantle that and change the way that we're, how to approach that, or to recognize when racism is occurring. How do we highlight that? I think there is a way, maybe that's the next step in some of the work that we're doing, to really think about engaging those approaches and integrating them. But I'd be curious to see if Dr. Keel has a solution.
I don't think I have a single solution. I would just simply say, and I was thinking about this given your presentation, the underrepresentation of Indigenous people or African people or others is by design. It's not an accidental. It reflects the value commitments of modern Western science. Black and brown bodies and lives have not mattered. And I think we have to just be honest about that if we're going to start talking about repair and redressing. If we pretend that medicine and health and science has been for everyone, then we're under the illusion that doesn't really allow us to see how these policies are actually working and how these forms of scientific research are happening. I mean, for Christ's sakes, the class I talked about was from a bombing in 1985, and the Coursera course was being taught as recently as just a couple of months ago. And so I think there needs to be a real sobering of the realities that people of color have faced in front of biomedical racism. I mean, the fact that in your own work, you show that the very concepts, the tools that researchers use when trying to study and analyze and identify the parts of Indigenous biology that's most valuable is out of step with these communities themselves. Talks about this. I think it's a symptom of a larger legacy of Western science and medicine being both a double-edged sword, both a tool for healing and a tool for violence. And I think that we just have to talk about these things with more clarity and honesty if we're really going to make some kind of progress going forward. And so that I don't have a solution other than just we need to have more conversation to be honest about our past, because again, the very practice, there is a direct line you can draw from someone like Samuel Morton or Johann Blumenbach, literally studying the skulls of Haitian slaves or Indigenous people who were being killed through the expansion of American empire, to extracting biological and genetic information from communities and not informing them about what they're doing. There's a line here. There's a history that we can see, we can talk about. Historians have told us for a very long time, and I think we have to take them seriously.
Yeah. No, thank you both for that. Dr. Garrison, can you please say a few more words about the intersections of biomedical research and Indigenous maternal health?
I'm just curious if this person is asking about something in particular, but I think with Indigenous maternal health, there's so many different disparities that we see. And I think there are, and what I've seen with COVID actually is there's a lot of distress that is happening with Indigenous maternal health, people who had been being turned away or being separated from their babies because of suspected COVID exposures and so forth. And there was a case in New Mexico a couple of months ago where this has happened. And I think there's just a lot of assumptions about where people live and looking at zip codes and making assumptions about potential exposures that have been really problematic. I think we see that in many different ways permeating biomedical research that just really sows distrust. And we need to put that aside, stop making assumptions about where people are from, where people are, who they may have been in contact with, but to ask them specifically, if they had an exposure rather than making assumptions about that. So I'd be happy to talk more about that offline as well.
I see William Brenner has their hand up. So we will open the floor.
I'm unmuted. I'm William Brett. I'm in the medical school, Reagan. I'm a cardiac surgeon, so I'm far afield, but I worked with Dr. Michael Baden, who was mentioned as a medical investigator for the city of New York while I was a general surgery resident because of an internship I took with Dr. Baden in forensic pathology in my 4th year elective. And I've stayed in touch with these fields and read about it widely. And I have some questions for the speakers whom I enjoyed their talks immensely. One, the Waco incident was about a federal government attacking whites, mainly, I think, exclusively, and murdering children also. And basically, because perhaps like the Philadelphia incident of 1985, these were perceived as cults or very strange groupings, the society didn't seem to care about it at all. And obviously with the George Floyd incident, a single individual's murder, which I believe it was a murder, a deliberate murder. I think the murderer wanted that person dead and didn't care about anything else that was happening around him. He just wanted him dead. That didn't really come up, but that's my personal opinion. It was a murder. And the other murder by the federal government of children who were present in that compound when it was assaulted by the armed forces of this country, there was no serious discussion about it. I'd like to hear Dr. Keel's, if I'm too far afield or if it's relevant.
I don't know if I understand your point, because there's enough examples in American history to show that the state violence against all of its subjects is something that this country will do when it feels the need to do it. But I will not agree that sort of this state violence has been equitable across racialized groups. I mean, we just saw white nationalists storm the Capitol with armed guns. And that happened, and we can only imagine if there were African Americans or indigenous groups or Chicano Latinx populations doing the very same thing. I think we would all be honest and say there'd be a very different outcome. And so I think that, I don't say that to dismiss the death of the children in the Waco incident. I think there's a long legacy of this nation using state violence to suppress and to deal with groups that they see as enemies of the state. But I don't think that violence has been equitable or democratic by any means. I think that it's been, there's quite a bit of evidence to show that it's stacked against people of color or people who oppose the state. And so if your question is about that, then I don't think that there is a connection, even though the loss of life and the loss of children are always going to be problematic. I think that people of color have suffered very long under state violence, and I think that we just have to be honest about that.
Well, another area is that in 1969, when I graduated from New York University Medical School, I was taught in presenting a patient always to mention the race or the ethnicity of the patient as being relevant to the diseases that would be expected to be more frequent in that subgroup. And when I came to California in 1976, suddenly residents were presenting patients without mentioning their race or ethnicity. And I thought that that was somehow diminishing my ability to understand the subject that was being examined. And it's continued to this day, even though we realize that there are racial and ethnic disparities or proclivities to suffer more from certain diseases based on your race and ethnicity. So I'd like the speakers to comment to that question.
I'll just say really quickly that I'll pass it on to Dr. Garrison. I think medical schools are in a crisis around race. There's been a lot of mobilizing and activism around medical students. White coats or Black lives has hit almost every major medical school. I give a lot of talks at medical schools, and they're trying to understand how do you incorporate nuanced ways of thinking about race in medical school curricula that doesn't reproduce the racist forms of biologizing difference that we saw in previous generations. And there's a lot of work to be done. And I think that work is literally being handed out now as we see it. But until we get there, I think we're going to find a lot of ambivalence around how we train medical students. There's not a consensus, even among medical school faculty, on whether we should actually have anti-racist training that looks at these issues. And so I think until the faculty themselves also begin to realize the values of this type of training and pedagogy, as I mentioned, the Journal of American Medical Association, some faculty in med schools don't think that this will actually create good doctors, and some disagree with that. And so we're in this moment of conflict right now, and I think that it's going to take some time to work itself out.
Yeah. I'll just add, and Dr. Keel talked about the importance of language and framing. So we know that because of the structure of society, there are different prevalences of different diseases among groups because of the stratification of race in this country. What happens is when we present in a case, when we present race, what we are saying is it is because of the person's race that they have this issue. So if we really want to engage in that, what we could say is, I'm presenting a 59-year-old person who has been subjected to racism all of his life, because it is the racism that is what has given this person, put this person in a situation to have increased risk of A, B, or C. So if that is what we want to articulate to the team when we're presenting, then that might be a way to consider having that dialogue, right? Because now we're not blaming the individual, we are actually capturing the structures and systems that have placed this individual, or at least place the community, to the group to which this individual belongs, in this situation that they could be exposed to this. We may not know. That particular individual may or may not have, or may have different levels of exposure, but that would be closer to a closer approximation as to why that individual has higher rates of diabetes or has higher rates of hypertension. So that might be something that we could sort of toss around as part of the medical school. I do want to get to some other questions that are here. Thank you very much, Dr. Brenner. Let's see. Nanibaa, you had mentioned all of us. So, and one of the questions is, what do you think about programs like All of Us, where, and you know, with the goal to diversify representation, but not really focusing on specific research and medical questions that communities may prioritize, right? Because it's still the medical community prioritizing, but not the communities themselves.
Right, right. So very briefly, the All of Us research program is an NIH-funded program that seeks to capture a whole range of different diversity that we see in medicine and biology in Americans across the country. And one big part of it that I've been particularly interested in is their goal to also do genetic sequencing of individuals who volunteer to participate in this program. One of the things that has been an issue over the past couple of years is the way that they have been engaging or trying to engage, or the lack of engagement with communities of color. In particular with Indigenous peoples, there was a lot of stated goals at the beginning of the project to oversample Indigenous peoples, because Indigenous peoples have been very underrepresented in genetic research studies. And I think the motivations initially were good. You know, people wanted to use this as a way to sort of address that inequity and try to increase the representation. But the problem ended up being that the leaders of the program did not really go out and engage with communities. There was a lack of tribal consultations and other ways of formally engaging people to really see if they would be on board or help with recruitment or things like that. And because of that lack of engagement, it really put more people on edge, and more people were very hesitant to participate and became even more mistrustful of the way that happened. I think with a lot of different research studies, if engagement doesn't happen from the very beginning, before the project is even announced, before the research funding is secured, then you're going to have these problems where people are not feeling like they're on board or trusting the research process, or they might believe that there might be different ulterior motivations behind the research that they might not be on, that the community members might not be on board with. And so if the engagement happened appropriately and tribes were allowed to really decide if they wanted to opt in or not, then we might have a very different scenario with people who are participating in a different way. I think that unfortunately there were some missteps. This could have been a really great learning opportunity for finding ways of meaningfully thinking about recruitment and doing some educational outreach that just didn't happen, or it's starting to happen now, but it's a little too late already.
Thank you very much. Another question. Are there any structures, processes, or mandates you might recommend that biomedicine put in place to address racism? Or any that you feel have been put in place or tried that have been somewhat effective? Or maybe not effective?
I'll just, I mean, that's a great question. It's a big question.
Right.
There's a lot of conversation happening in the chat right now. I would say, listen to the medical students, listen to the students that you're training, because a lot of them have these critical sensibilities around these issues, and they're just demanding that their faculty and their administrators and their institutional leaders listen to them and provide training that responds to the movement that we are seeing right now around Black Lives Matter and around dismantling forms of structural racism. So that's what I would say. And I would also say that our elected officials and policymakers have an obligation, I think, to understand that from a public health level, policies around everything from urban planning and development to economic policies or health policies. This isn't a new point. Public health researchers have been telling us for years. And so if we want to undo racism in our societies, we literally have to design better laws. We literally have to design better forms of accountability for everything from police violence to malpractice in the clinical encounter. And we need government to help us do that.
Okay.
But just to add, I think Dr. Norris, your proposed description of a case, talking about a patient where we say this patient has been subjected to racism all their lives, is another interesting way of doing that. I don't think we should take race out of the question. I don't think we should say, that we should ignore it, because that won't solve the problem, but we have to be more savvy about how we think about how race is contextualized and how it matters in medicine. It does matter, but it's not the reason why people are, have certain medical conditions. I mean, it is and it isn't, but it shouldn't be the primary reason. In my previous roles, I also used to be very involved in clinical ethics consultations. And it was always so interesting to me when sometimes people would talk about the race of a patient up front, other times they wouldn't. And in those cases where they didn't mention the race until somebody asked, it really changed everybody's perception of that patient and really made them start thinking about additional factors that they should have considered, or maybe it made them realize their biases about that patient. So it matters, but it also sometimes might cloud our judgment or influence the way we think in a way that is not fair to the patient.
Right. And I think that's the concern when it's brought up in the beginning of a conversation, because we have these biases, and so already that will cloud one's judgment and one's thought process and thinking through what might be going on. And so, we need a greater awareness that race is not a risk factor for a medical problem. Race is a risk factor for racism, and racism is the risk factor for medical conditions. And then racism has its own biology, right? So Dr. Keel talked, so biology, racism has a large portion of biology, and then there may be other aspects there may be some gross associations, right? But race is a guess of where someone's continental ancestry is. And someone's continental ancestry is a guess of a variety of different prevalences of polymorphisms that are very, very heterogeneous across large geographic areas. And so, you can't look at somebody and know what their gene polymorphism is, profile. So that we have to measure. So we have had a great presentation today. Sorry we didn't get to all the questions, but I think we've clearly raised a lot of people's consciousness, hopefully, and getting people thinking about some different things, from issues of race and genetics to participating with communities and engaging communities across all aspects of the research activity when possible, and making sure that their voice and interpretations are heard as we're analyzing and interpreting data and things of that nature, and really working with our community members as partners. So I used to talk about, my partner, Loretta Jones, would talk about PhDs of the sidewalk, but I heard Cheryl Grills talk yesterday about the WMD, which is what matters degree, right? And so that's working with community partners. So
That's well said, Dr. Norris.
Want to remind everybody that coming up June 25th is Measuring Economic Status for Health Disparities, Research in Time-Constrained Settings in Low and Middle Income Countries, and its application for the study of risk factors for intentional injury in Cameroon. So want everybody to set that time aside if you can make it. It would be great to have you join for this conversation on June 25th. And Ethel, anything else at this point?
You got it all, Dr. Norris.
Okay.
If you want to sign up, you could just use your cell phone to scan the QR code, and it'll take you to the sign up page.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for your attention and your participation today. And thank you again to our speakers.
Thank you, Dr. Norris. Thank you, Dr.
Thank you.
Garrison. And thank you, Dr. Head.
This was great. It was really wonderful to do this with you. Thank you so much.
No, this is great to have the two of you, and it was a nice juxtaposition, but it was, and I think it touched upon lots of issues that are of interest to a lot of people who are sort of thinking through issues of race, racism, health, and thinking about it from a research perspective, and thinking about it from, how do we integrate our community partners in this, and how do we do it in the most respectful way? And then, and how do we talk amongst colleagues, et cetera, et cetera. So there's lots of different elements. And I think it was great to hear from the two of you, how people might go about that. So it was great. I see people are still hanging on. It's cool.
Thank you,
I have to
everyone.
run to another event. Take care, everyone.
Take care. Bye-bye.
All right.